Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Anna Rubo. I'm a board member of the Consortium of Sustainable Urbanization and a researcher at Columbia University. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome folks from around the world to this exciting event in Sydney. For those joining for the first time, the CSU mission ranges from increasing awareness about emerging urban issues, facilitating knowledge transfer between and among policy and decision makers, and fostering connections, cooperation, and collaboration, while all the time promoting the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. CSU seeks to build bridges between the UN and civil society, the design professions, business, academia, and allied organizations. We are a non-profit volunteer-led organization with lots of ideas. For example, in 2023, we began our youth program and funded 3 students to attend the Union of International Architects in Congress in Copenhagen. This year, we aim to support youth attendance at the UN Habitat World Urban Forum. We hope also to support the studies of some design and planning students in need in developing countries. So we invite everyone to visit our CSU website, see our resources, publications, our Green Cities and Green Books talks, and join us for our 2024 events. I would also like to draw your attention to our upcoming gala on March 20th, where we aim to raise funds for these and other CSU programs, as well as celebrate our 2024 honorees. We would be delighted if you can attend our gala in New York or make a donation online to CSU. Now, I am joined here by our guests, architects and City of Sydney councillors, Philip Thalis and William Chan. Between them, they have served on Sydney City Council for 7 years. Today, we want to explore their experience as elected officials, what they as architects bring to the job, the challenges, the successes, the disappointments. I hope they may have advice for architects aspiring to public service. Before we start, I would like, as is custom here, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet virtually today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Sydney was founded in 1788 by James Cook. To Cook and the colonial and convict settlers, it was a terra nullius, an empty place. To the Durag, Daral, and Aurora peoples who had lived on and cared for country for 60,000 years, it was anything but that. This invasion and the appropriation of traditional lands and culture had devastating impacts. Today, there's a growing understanding that Aboriginal knowledge and wisdom, especially with regard to land and climate change, holds a key to the future. So let's now turn to the present. Excuse me. Today, Sydney is a dynamic city, best known perhaps for the Sydney Opera House and its stunning Sydney Harbour, an emerald city. I'm very sorry. In the words of celebrated playwright David Williamson. According to the Global Livability Index for 2023, Sydney is the 4th most livable city in the world, right behind Vienna, Copenhagen, and yes, Melbourne. However, with a population of 5 million, the city is beset by the high cost of housing, sprawl, traffic congestion, increasing income inequality, development pressures, greed, and a race to keep ahead of climate change in a national economy buoyed by coal exports. To set the stage for today's conversation, let's take a quick look at some of these factors that may help orient our international audience. Let's start with housing. Now, the median price of housing in Sydney is a cool $1.6 million. The median price of a unit or an apartment is around $800,000, and rents or mortgage payments easily take up more than 30% of household income. As in many cities, Airbnb contributes to housing scarcity. Homelessness is present in all major cities. Now, the pain caused by the current high cost of living and housing prices becomes clear when you look at income and wealth inequality. The average salary in Sydney is $80,000, but many live on incomes under 50. On average, in 2021, 20% of households earned 6 times as much as the bottom 20%. Inequality and exclusion can be measured spatially by comparing access to jobs, education, health, services, transport, and open space. Any of these metrics are more extreme for Indigenous Australians. As ANU demographer Liz Allen said a couple of years ago, Australia needs more people with lived experience of disadvantage and in positions of leadership and power to undo the entrenched mechanics driving inequality in Australia. That sounds like very good advice. It also offers a segue to the City of Sydney and to our speakers who, along with their fellow councillors, are committed to listening to the communities they represent. The City of Sydney jurisdiction, just a little few details on that, includes the city centre plus 33 inner suburbs and counts for around 4% of the population of the Greater Sydney metropolis. Clover Moore, a progressive independent, has been mayor since 2004. With a long commitment to good urbanism and addressing climate change, the city is now working to achieve its sustainable strategy for 2030-2050. As stated in the plan, the vision is for a socially just and resilient city where people from all walks of life can live, work, learn, play, and grow. The city is deeply committed to reconciliation in partnership with its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. A major step towards this goal will be achieving functional zero homelessness, end of quote. City Sydney Council has benefited from several architect urbanist councillors who have helped shape the mayor's vision for the city. Now I would like to briefly introduce our guests. Philip Thalis is a former City of Sydney councillor. He served on council from 2016 to 2021. He is principal of Hill Thalis Architecture and Urban Projects, a practice recognised for its independent standpoint and design expertise across a range of project types and scales. Working equally for public and private clients, the practice has won more than 100 state and national awards, commendations, and competition prizes for architectural, urban, public domain, and heritage projects. He actively promotes the culture of architecture and city planning, combining practice with teaching, research, publication, community activism, and criticism. He has lectured extensively at universities here and internationally. He has taught throughout his career and has held a professorship at New South Wales since 2017. Now, William Chan was elected to the City of Sydney Council in 2021. The youngest serving council member of record, I believe. He is an architect creating impact in planning, transport, heritage, environment, sustainability, culture, creativity, and inclusion. He is an executive of Climate Emergency Australia, which represents over 100 local governments accelerating a zero carbon economy. He was appointed the World Economic Forum's Global Public Leadership Fellow in 2021. He led Sydney's delegation to COP28, the first ever UN climate change conference to include city leaders in the decision-making process. William is a TED featured speaker, a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree, Green Biz Young Global Sustainability Leader of the World Business Council, and he was a keynote next-gen speaker at the Union of Architects Leave No One Behind Congress last year in Copenhagen. He is a graduate of the University of Sydney and Milan. It is my greatest pleasure to have him and Philip here. Now, we discussed how we might best convey to you the roles of architectural turned elected officials. Each will present a short slideshow at their time in local government, what comes across their desks, what they contribute. I will follow up with some questions, including an education one. If there is a real benefit in electing urban professionals to office, how might they best be prepared? Now, I know that there will be many questions for Philip and William, so please use the chat function to submit your questions, and we will do our best to answer all. Philip, the screen is yours, and welcome to both you and William. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'll just try to transfer over. Share. Is that sharing for everybody? Yep.
Yes.
So thanks, Anna, for the potted introduction, and I also acknowledge the Gadigal people on land on whom we sit, and their elders past, present, and emerging. I came to council quite different to William in that I'd actually first been involved in local politics in the city almost upon graduation. back in the mid-1980s. So for me, it's very much consistent with my professional and civic life. And this was the last council meeting that I sat at. 10 councillors. On the left-hand side are the independents aligned with the Lord Mayor Clover Moore. You can see the senior staff and the like. And this is the agenda of the last council meeting in which I sat. And what I've listed on the right are the things which, you know, I bring to the table in terms of their agenda. Public projects we do. Like William was chair of the local pedestrian cycling traffic calming committee, which is otherwise in other councils called the traffic committee. Public projects, public space, planning and design, policy settings, heritage. They're all my day job, as well as the role I could play on council, partly as an advocate, partly as an explainer, partly as a proponent. For those of you not from Sydney, just to give you some idea of just the city centre. So in green is the boundary of the city of Sydney as a council entity. It's only 26 square kilometres in a sprawling metropolis, which goes 8 to 10 kilometres east to the coastline. That's Bondi Beach for those not Sydney, and 60 kilometres west to the mountains. We had actually undertaken many projects already in the city of Sydney, some for the city and some for private clients, including involvement in 2030, which William will talk to. We had, with others, won the international competition for what's now known as Barangaroo in 2006. And we did that as 3 small Sydney-based practices against global competition, 2-stage competition, and it very much proposed anchoring the what was the lost northwest corner of the city back into the city centre and creating the entire foreshore as inalienable public parkland. So it's a very Sydney story that what's actually happened at Barangaroo is the exact antithesis of what the ethos that drove our scheme. And just to emphasise, you know, we won the scheme on the government's brief, on the government selected jury, they picked us. And so it's clearly very, I've actually done a history of Sydney competitions back to 1842. It's not the greatest read. And what we said to the jury, and what I continue to say, is that, you know, in the public, this was public land, 22 hectares of public land. It's almost exactly the same size as Battery Park City, if you want some New York comparator. Really, the public land needs to be driven by the public interest. I'm a strong advocate of the open city concepts of democratic space and the like. And this was what we finished by saying to the jury. What's played out at Barangaroo over the intervening decades is the exact opposite, and it's not very often that architects get to fight on the front page of newspapers with former prime ministers, and this is Paul Keating. My characterisation of the worst of Dubai, Keating's work of fiction. This is what Sydney needs, the position of profound ignorance. So a younger me in contest with Keating. After that, we picked up on research that we had started at various universities back in the early 2000s, and with my colleague Peter John Cantle, we produced a book called Public Sydney, where we actually sought to draw literally all of the public elements of the city and to try to, again, to explain them. And as mentioned, of course, the Opera House. So you can see they're all drawn to the same scale, and to understand how the Opera House came to be, to explain to people the good things about Sydney, but also the mistakes. And I think people far too often take for granted the good things, and it's important to champion the people who made them happen. And one of the key things about public space, and one of my many criticisms of Barangaroo, is the lack of intelligent discussion of streets and street systems, because streets are the public armature of the city. And they're not just the public armature of city today, they're the public armature of, in fact, almost every city in history on every continent. And there's so much more than about traffic. And again, I follow lots of North American people on social media. I find that the discussion too limiting about traffic versus obviously the dominance of traffic, of motor vehicle traffic. And it's just one event. But I want to emphasize the city as social space, the urban life of the city. The biggest landscape resource in the city is not, in fact, the parks, it's the streets. this most ancient form of urbanism, the street, in fact, has allowed the city to modernise itself and to continue to modernise itself because the streets form a reticulated pattern, and not for 1 minute to devalue the spatial and civic qualities of street design. So these are two views 100 years apart from the tower of the town hall. In fact, looking north, all the buildings have gone. I say to the architects, the street pattern is the thing that persists, and the quality of the street pattern is essential to assess the quality of any city. In our book, in fact, there's a compendium of all of the different cross sections, all to the same scale of the public works, from actually the biggest, the Opera House. No one realizes how big it is, to the Harbour Bridge and lots of things in between. We've since turned it into a jigsaw puzzle. Not many good urban jigsaw puzzles. I was in New York late last year. The rubbish jigsaw puzzles. We think we're very keen on this one. And in fact, I've turned then into social media through Public Sydney hashtag. So I could bring all of that background to my role as a councillor, so quite different life experience to William, given age. And so this is my first council meeting with a great ally, Jess Scully, who went on to be a Deputy Lord Mayor. I've just characterised my role under these 5 headings: advocacy, engagement, opposition, proposition, and projects. So I'll just run through those very quickly. Of course, you attract immediately media attention. I was, in fact, very used to that from decades of controversy and advocacy here with the Lord Mayor in one of the new areas of Sydney, in the South Green Square, and Clover's very proud achievement, obviously over 2 decades of making 40 new parks. So opening a park is always a great community activity, and it's not enough to say that the open space in a city is enough. If you're going to increase the density, the importance of public space is augmented. Lots of opportunities for engagement, either formal ones through city talks or informal ones here in a public housing estate in Woolloomooloo, opening the repainted mural in the basketball courts. Sydney's about to have the Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, and this was always a fun thing to evoke the Beatles and to promote that. In fact, we're going to the flag raising, William and I, tomorrow night. Opposition in New South Wales, there was so much to oppose, but in the actions, the ignorant, destructive actions of successive state governments. And so Barangaroo, obviously, I could continue to oppose, and it's worth stating, some of people in the audience, there's an opportunity to continue to oppose Central Barangaroo up here. Submissions are due in the next couple of weeks. And one of the greatest travesties in Sydney, and this is one of my favourite Instagram posts, is the casino on the waterfront. And Australian cities really, if you want to see corruption, if you want to call it whatever, there's all sorts of corruption, some illegal, some not. Corruption in Sydney, you have casinos, waterfront redevelopment, motorways and stadia. There's always a rat in there somewhere. And the casino at Sydney, which is on the foreshore, is an absolute disgrace, and I hope the only benefit is it'll stand as a marker for what not to do for the next 100 years. But as Anna said, one of the key roles as a councillor is to support the disadvantaged. And what was fantastic, in contradistinction to my professional life, was to champion social housing and to meet the tenants of social housing. This is one of the big battles with the local member, Alex Greenwich, Tanya Plibersek, the federal member, and Clover. And to champion the public housing, the best public housing built in Australia 120 years ago at Millers Point, and not for sale. This is my tweet. This is actually what I did my master's thesis on. This public housing, speaking with the residents, the tenants, was fantastic. And so they're saying not for sale. And so the point with this public housing was that, it had been built by government, held by government in trust for the disadvantaged through world wars, depressions, booms and busts, and needlessly sold for exploitative gain. This is now all Airbnb. You had fora to speak out against, obviously a very rapacious period of Sydney's life, continuing under a new government. You got to meet people of culture and put forward ideas. And this is a square in front of the State Library. Incredibly, it's a project we are now doing as architects. with the distinguished actor John Bell and the State Librarian. And you got to talk about city making and the public interest. And I think to be the champion of the public interest is one of the privileges of being a councillor. But in fact, I think it's an absolute responsibility of being a professional and a citizen. Got to talk about transport in Martin Place in the centre of the city. And then in terms of projects, I was able to lead with Jess Scully this alternative housing ideas, because housing affordability is a crisis in all leading world cities, and we need new additional ways of thinking about it and including a broader audience. So this is one of the excellent city talks that the city has to engage with the community, to involve them, much better than watching TV. And the process is you put up a notice of motion or resolution to council, and then it's adopted. The city then had a competition. It was fast-tracked. It had a huge interest, particularly from younger people who feel acutely this need. And then some of the winners here, there were 7 winners, but the community land trust model, which is very much a North American idea to try to preserve things in an ownership structure which can't be corrupted, and a very interesting scheme, and several of the winners could be segued together, which is borrows from methodologies in Zurich, where you cross-subsidise public and affordable housing with other elements, so a small hotel, a daycare, retail and the like. And so, you know, I look back on the 5.5 years as sort of the length of high school or primary school. It certainly seemed to go much quicker than that. It was an extended period because of COVID. And the incredible opportunities that were given, and the opportunities which I continue to take, partly on the back of my role as a councillor in advocating for a better city. Hope I didn't go too long. Anna, passing back.
Thanks, Philip.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. It was a very, very comprehensive view, and I'm very happy to see that you focus so much on housing, which, as we all know, is really a sort of crisis pitch. So let's turn now to William's presentation, and I would ask if anybody who is tuning, if you mute your image because it tends to obscure the screen a little bit. That would be just great. So I'd now like to ask Councillor H.Y. William Chan to continue with a sort of a younger and different view of this. And just before we do go, could you please mute your image if you are not on screen? So thank you very much. Over to you, William.
Thank you, Anna. And Bujari Gamarua, Din Babana Gamarada Gadigal Nukura. So good day and welcome in the traditional language of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. My journey into politics as a young architect is somewhat unexpected. Some could say I'm a gentle politician. Something that I've taken into my stride in terms of defining the space I occupy, especially as a younger person, but also as a person of colour. Now, this becomes really important in terms of representation that Anna had mentioned in the introductions. Being representative of our city, the city of Sydney, is actually a very young community, but it's also very diverse. Over 50% of the city of Sydney were born overseas. I was myself born in Hong Kong. And at the same time, we have over 50% who are aged between 18 years of age up to 35. And again, I fit into that category. That kind of representation isn't something you would normally see in local governments across Australia, given that the remuneration isn't great. It is a part-time role. And so you normally have retirees being the growing age group in terms of putting their hand up into politics at the local level. So for me, it's really important to really see my role in terms of my professional expertise The Lord Mayor Clovermore has actually, for every single term, this is the 5th term that she has led the City of Sydney, she has always had either an architect or an urban planner elected as a politician in her government. Philip was the previous architect, and I've been able to stand on his shoulders in terms of doing this work at the moment. So I've been elected for 2 years and 3 months. It's a shorter term due to the COVID pandemic. I think it's also really important for me to talk about the design excellence and why we've always had a design professional on council. This is something that the Lord Mayor has consistently been advocating, but also in terms of her understanding of good design, the planning process, and how we can actually innovate policy to create the public outcomes, the built environment results that we want to see transforming in our city. And finally, the Lord Mayor's husband is an architect, and I do think that has an influence in terms of her understanding and her leadership in this area. How do we make decisions, and how do we actually ensure that we're representing the community? For me, it's always been a balance of the expertise, the knowledge that I bring, but also our city staff and their advice to us councillors. We all, of course, are community representatives at the same time, so we also have to balance that with the community needs which are constantly evolving, and ones that as independents, so both Philip and I are not part of the major political parties. The government in Sydney is an independent team of elected representatives. So back in 2019, the city actually engaged in what was our largest community engagement program. This included a citizens' jury, where we looked at how we can actually devolve decision-making to the grassroots. How can we actually look at urban governance from a much more people-centered local level where they have a voice? So 50 randomly selected citizens from the local area who are representative of our demographics were invited to come together over weekends, over 4 months, to actually decide the important priorities for 2050. Now, this is a very tough task. At the beginning, the citizens' jurors were focused on the local issues of today and now. They wanted more trees on their streets. They wanted the garbage to be picked up a lot more. But I was one of the expert witnesses, so we had about 10 expert witnesses akin to a jury model of the law courts, and we were there to really help facilitate and push in terms of that thinking towards the future. How do we actually think? So here's a photo of all the citizens, of the expert witnesses that were part of that process. But how do we actually push our citizens to think beyond themselves, to think about others? How do we push beyond the now and today, and to think about the next, not even the next 10 years, but the next 30 years? And this is something that they were able to manage to do, come to consensus and really think about the next generation of Sydney citizens who will inherit our city. This work was presented back to council and the Lord Mayor and city staff, and was actually adopted in terms of this new strategy, continuing the vision 2030 to 2050. You can see the 6 guiding principles, and I'll just now quickly go through some of the top 5 visions that we worked locally to really convey and communicate what the Sydney of 2050 might look like. So our work has really focused on First Nations and that understanding. It's interesting to note for an international audience that for the past 5 years, all the architecture schools in Australia, they have professors now in First Nations and Indigenous design, and it is compulsory for architecture students to study how to design with country. Our state government architect has over 5 years now, finalised the draft Designing for Country framework, as well as how we can focus on educating current professionals. As a registered architect, you have to now do continued professional development, 1 hour in designing for country, to really understand how we can look at Indigenous knowledge, but also how we can have this very much a recognition of our First Nations community and them being represented. So for us, this is one of our projects in terms of creating this new foreshore walk where we can actually have that truth telling and that history represented. We've since 2008 worked with Danish architect Jan Gale to transform our city, and we've been able to pedestrianise George Street, and that has really been our new central pedestrian spine, and hopefully in the future will be linked with 3 new city squares, connecting Central Square Station to Town Hall to Circular Quay. We're increasing greening. We want to have green corridors and boulevards. We're increasing all our cycleways. And this hasn't been without opposition. Every single cycleway that I put up at council is adamantly opposed. It is something that's very tough to deal with. All our business community, even our residents, don't even want footpath widening. They don't want more trees and water-sensitive urban design in terms of rainwater gardens. But I think it's really important that we actually bring them along the journey. Part of this decision-making process is showing how we can physically transform our city centre, but also by doing the work bit by bit. As Jan Gale talks about, removing the car spots space by space on our streets. And we're doing that planting, we're doing those works to create a more vibrant, pedestrian friendly, and that the research shows that also it's really great for small businesses and the economic impacts in terms of that type of activation. So a lot of lessons learned during COVID as well in terms of how do we look after our most vulnerable in terms of our homelessness. And I'll touch on a bit more later on in terms of our housing policies. But I think one of the big issues is how do we communicate? And perhaps my architectural education, my professional experience didn't really allow me to learn these more nuanced skills on being in a public profile. This is our big 2050 vision for creating a swimmable harbour. And it was actually spruiked during our campaigning to be re-elected into government. This is actually this is what Philip has designed in terms of the existing Pyramid Park, and he's actually already has put in these steps into the harbour. The harbour isn't clean enough for it to be swimmable. These are big visions that really show potentially our community sentiments. But in terms of, as a politician, the priority for me is actually life beyond water, one of the SDGs, one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is about marine ecosystem. It is about climate action in terms of looking after ocean health. If we can look after that area, it will be clean. And then secondly, the second priority is actually about public space. For me, our Sydney Harbour is the most important public space in our city. It should be accessible to all, not just those who can afford to live on the harbour in mansions. So finally, how do we show success and how do we make sure that that is reached? Is by inviting our community to jump in when it's safe to do so, when it can be enjoyed as a public space for swimming. So I'll leave my presentation there and it'll be great to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, William. And I think that both of them are sort of quite different, but such complementary presentation. And before we invite some conversation or some questions to both William and Philip, I would like to just do a very quick follow-up with each of them, and please, as you're sort of digesting some of the immensity and the richness of the ideas and experience that we've just been shown, please start to think about what questions you might have and put some in the chat. So just going back to Philip, you talked a lot about housing, but I wondered if in just a very sort of, brief and perhaps speculative manner, you might sort of answer what is the answer to the housing affordability crisis? Is there an answer? This may be too difficult a question, but I think it's a question that is absolutely on everybody's minds. I see it as young people who can no longer live in the city that people of yours and my generation used to, people who can no longer stay in the city, people who can no longer afford to be in the city. So what is, and we don't even start to talk about migrant populations or Indigenous populations where the stress is even worse. But there is one thing that maybe our international audience wouldn't be aware of. In the US, it's quite easy to get a 30-year locked-in mortgage. Here, that doesn't happen. So one hears endless stories of people whose mortgages have gone up because of the interest rates increasing by $1,000 a month. And suddenly the financial stress, while we appear to be a very wealthy country, the financial stress is huge. Anyway, so is there an answer to the housing affordable crisis? What's on the top of your brain that we might sort of offer to the world? Philip, I think you're muted. Philip, can you unmute?
Yes. This is a global challenge, obviously, to all leading world cities, but there's obviously particular Sydney or Australian problems with it. Yes, there are answers in the plural, and they're not being actively taken up politically. The first one that so many cities have to do is to build more public and affordable housing, and that in New South Wales is the responsibility of the federal and state governments, who simply have been defunding public housing for 30 years or more. And interestingly, in England, there's a rebirth of public housing led by the councils, who were the agents of that. In Australia, there's obviously discriminatory tax regimes, negatively gearing capital gains tax concessions, which should be abolished immediately. Airbnb needs to be wound back. Planning needs to be much more intelligent and much more subtle and targeted. And so my predecessor on council was John Mant, who was a leading planning lawyer, had written the Local Government Act. He said you need inclusionary zoning. That is, whenever you have an uplift in density, the percentage of that is retained to fund public and affordable housing. The state governments just put a big uplift in density on the table. 2% is the dismal figure for inclusionary zoning that they've put forward, when in other jurisdictions we know it's 10%, it's 15%, it's 20%. So there's so many more things that can be done by all levels of government. I certainly was encouraging the city to reinvest in public and affordable housing. When Clover was more William's age, she was on council where the city's stock of public housing, because they'd been building it over a century, was in fact handed to the state government for no dollars by an administrator, and that was an enormous financial blow to the city and took out their agency in terms of being a proponent, actual constructor and owner of public housing. The city clearly needs to get involved in multiple ways as well, but I think it really needs to be a complete change to the mindset of housing being an investment, as opposed to housing being a right to live in the city.
Right. I think we really need to re-invoke Lefebvre's right to the city.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that succinct, and I'm sure that's stimulated a few questions. William, I'm going to push you on another issue, which is you went to COP28 and you went to UIA 2023. Are there any lessons that you brought back to the City of Sydney Council that you think were important? And if so, would you like to just share them briefly?
Absolutely. I think it's been, look, it has certainly both experiences in terms of the connections, the knowledge sharing, but also the advocacy work. I think sometimes, you know, and Anna, you know this quite well, working in the area towards social justice in our cities, towards climate action. It is tough work. It is hard when there is the urgency. There's so much weight, collective weight on our shoulders, especially for architects who have decided to pursue this line of work, but to really create that impact. It was actually the first time where I felt I had made the right decision of leaving traditional practice and being part of an architectural community, part of a sustainability community, where I am at the right place in the right time of doing this really important work. And I would urge anyone else who is interested in terms of creating sustainable cities to join this. The UIA conference was the first time I've been to UIA in Durban about 10 years ago, and to other architectural forums and meetings. And it was the first time where cities were mentioned. It was the first time architects in the room were questioning, where are the politicians? Let's talk about the politics that influence what we can and can't do and the limitations as a professional sector. And so it was really eye-opening and enlightening. And of course, the UIA theme for last year in Copenhagen was Leave No One Behind. And I was a bit cheeky in terms of addressing the architects and being able to actually push them. And what I said was, we need to actually, before we answer that question, we have to self-reflect and ask, hang on, how did we get to this state? How do we get to a point where we have left people behind? We have to acknowledge that as a profession, we have left people behind. And we need to do that first before we can move on to the solution. Now, COP28 in Dubai was interesting in terms of the feedback and the final outcomes. But what was historic was the first time through a COP presidency, cities were invited to actually have a seat at the decision-making table. And this was done through the COP presidency and Michael Bloomberg through Bloomberg Philanthropies. When we look back at the last, the most successful COP in history, which was Paris, after Kyoto, mayors and city leaders, what we call subnational governments, were actually on the sidelines. They all met in the Paris City Hall, an hour and a half away from where presidents and prime ministers were making deals and negotiating at the COP venue. This time, we were invited to the COP venue. So it was historic in that sense. We had 60 countries now signed up to the multi-level governance coalition, which allows the national governments to actually work very closely with city governments towards reaching their Paris agreements, what's called the national determined contributions. And not only just the city's emissions, but also city solutions. As you can see, we're very much the most direct level of governments to our people and communities. And of course, COP in Dubai allowed us to also do the first global stocktake, GST, which is the first review of how all countries are going towards the Paris agreements. And finally, there was the new agenda of having a new global goal on adaptation. And this really changes the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by adding a new one for 2030, which is all about adaptation. We still have to focus on resilience, that's important, but it's a clear recognition that we need to start adapting because climate change is already here.
Thank you. I think that's the most useful contribution, and it's lovely to bring back to the local what you have been doing internationally. Now, we're going to run out of time a little bit. So I thought, and William, you have already mentioned this some, but I would like to give you both the opportunity to just reflect a little bit on the sort of question of education and preparedness. And maybe just in a sort of very shorthand way to say, what might be the best preparation? Because William, you mentioned now the requirement for all students of architecture to become familiar with Indigenous issues, understanding of country. But if we're talking about effectiveness in local government, to make that transition, and I'm sure both of you, well, Philip was more in the public eye before than you are, but to make that transition to actually work in this space is extremely demanding. And I'm just wondering, and I might go to Philip first, but just a very few ones, because we got to leave a little bit of time. There's a couple of questions that I think would be great to answer. But Philip, you know, you're teaching at UNSW. You do a lot of teaching around the place. Do you have any sort of ideas of how you might best prepare young people? Because you know, there's always people who are interested in this, but how do you actually prepare them? Is there a course that should be included? Is there subject matter that should be included? Could you each just address that just very briefly? That would be terrific.
I think it's just the way you teach, whatever the subject is, and I teach in a wide variety of subjects, from the design studio to history to professional practice to urban theory to landscape. You've just got to emphasize, I think, the public dimension and the involvement, and you've got to put people in the shoes of explaining it to a broader audience. So I think teaching's actually taught me an enormous amount about that, to how to keep students engaged and how to give students the breadth of issues that they need. So I've found teaching indispensable to my practice. There is just also one thing that William highlighted, which I didn't sufficiently highlight, is actually the quality of the city as a public client and their incredible track record of architecture and urban spaces. And I think, you know, our greatest, it's critical that we're much better advocates, but it's also critical that we have great work to point to and to take people to and to show them that this is possible within our culture. And I think the city's legacy on that under Clover is remarkable.
Thank you. William, what would you like to add to that question?
Look, I think the biggest gap that I am trying to address through this new initiative that I've started called Citizen Architecture is, and since being elected, is our communities are passionate to engage with urban development. They want to have a say. They want to learn the tools, but they're not equipped with the tools. In fact, what I found is that the planning system, and I believe this is common in other cities, global cities too, the planning system has been designed to exclude. It's been designed to make sure those who want to engage cannot. And it's fascinating working on one of the state government proposals and really advocating for better urban outcomes, better livability, better form making, but also even in terms of just the public space and heritage considerations. Other councillors and other state politicians from the big parties, they wanted the community just to oppose the state government. While from experience, we know when it's just opposition, when it's NIMBY, not in my backyard, it really empowers the state government to continue with what they are proposing to do, because you're not actually going through the nuances or the iterations as that we would go through as design professionals. So I really want to address that. And I think it's so important now to also look at the other side, and Philip and I share this sentiment that in Sydney, there is now also a YIMBY movement, a yes in my backyard.
Yes,
we also have to be careful about that, because good city making, good public outcomes isn't black and white. As we know, as architects and designers, there is no one solution. And sometimes people are not willing to, not necessarily compromise, but yes, compromise is an important skill as an elected official. But to actually collaborate, I think really the key engagement here is how we collaborate and actually work together. And the city has shown that this works through the city's own work in terms of our in-house planning team and design team, or giving alternative approaches or alternative schemes to the state government, and the state government really reviewing them and actually adopting that kind of design work.
I avoid the word compromise. I hate the word compromise. It's something that, you know, is bandied around in politics. I much prefer the term balance, because exactly what William you're talking about, you're actually faced with a range of competing, most of them valid criteria. It's how to bring them into some sort of equilibrium that is equitable,
And our
not
education is
compromise.
as architects, having
Yeah.
competing briefs, having to problem solve is really well standing in terms of the role of in politics.
Not a grubby deal.
And there have been a few of those. Fantastic. So just to conclude that, I would like to ask you, is there a role for schools to be more active players in developing this this idea of, I guess, public service, but also an awareness? And I would just sort of anecdotally say, I remember when John McInerney became city planner a number of years ago. And I remember saying to him, John, we have so many students who would be able to do projects that would be relevant to the city. And we could just set out a number of projects, and you have all this, young energy that could be directed towards thinking about possibilities. And I don't know whether there's been any concerted effort on the parts of schools to engage with local government, be it Sydney City Council or others, but to actually take on projects which they are under-resourced to really think about. And I do know that, the job of being a Sydney City Councillor is not remunerated well. It takes a lot of time. And is there a role for schools to be more actively engaged? The question would also occur to me is whether it's a much more interdisciplinary activity. And again, in sort of past teaching activities, we would involve ourselves with anthropology, we'd involve ourselves with social work, with different departments. And I don't know whether that happens anymore, but all of what you have spoken about is that this is very much a social, environmental, political, and cultural enterprise. So the question is perhaps, can the City of Sydney, through its schools and through other cities also, really try to work more constructively to get answers to some of the big problems, and of course expose younger people to the big problems? Anyway, I don't know whether you can answer that quickly.
William, in fact, there's an exhibition of schemes that Sydney University did, being hosted at Town Hall for the estate in Waterloo this week, William, isn't it? So, look, there are things that go on. It could be much more effective, I completely agree, and much more far-reaching, not just City of Sydney, in fact, with all local councils. There always are some little things happening, but not enough. And
Look,
I think it's just...
Okay.
I will say I am collaborating with one of the architecture schools in Sydney on doing a studio specifically on addressing these gaps, but having a direct interface with residents and communities. It's looking at somewhat a citizen scientist model of equipping. I know some architects in Sydney would really hate this, but really equipping, again, the tools of engagement, how they can actually respond. It is about that kind of education. And I think having passionate students, having young architects who have that knowledge and that enthusiasm to engage with our community, and then for community to engage back with the city council, back with the state government, is something I'm exploring.
And there's a couple of comments in the chat about that as well. And a year and a half ago, I was at Monash University in Melbourne with Mel Dodd, the professor, and she was, and Rory Hyde, deliberately trying to orient architects for public practice. And it's worth saying that in my working life, I worked in the New South Wales government when I was a student, best place to work, that the jobs in the state government for architects in public works and housing have been decimated. And so that needs to be rebuilt from the ground up.
Right. Excellent comments. So also, just to add to that, I think it seems to be to bring back what is certainly a sort of an interest of mine, but also of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanisation, which is how do we help achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? And so I think there's a linkage to be made there. Now we do have some questions in the chat, and I think Philip has looked at one of them, which is how do we engage the general public in these topics. There's probably much more that we could do with that, but that I think is always a key issue. There's another one which was asking, how can we reconsider the Australian obsession with home ownership? Can we look at alternative models, European-style tenancies? And I recall sort of quite a number of years ago when we brought housing exhibition called New Housing in Vienna to Sydney. And Vienna, of course, has been a wonderful model, both in housing typologies and in tenancy arrangements. Anyway, would you like to have a crack at how can we reconsider this obsession? Philip, maybe you could have a word on that.
Yes, I should have mentioned rental reform as well, and Vienna and Singapore are two leading cities which we're always citing as examples where you can do it so much better. In Australia at the moment, there's an obsession by the bigger players for a build-to-rent model, which is really just an exploitative capitalist mirage. It won't help affordable housing or rental conditions at all, but that seems to be the only lever that the federal government and state governments are jumping on, with taxation benefits for bigger players. Certainly we need a much more stable rental market with much greater flexibility and protection for renters. There's a high percentage of renters. We could have given the statistics in the city of Sydney as well, that, you know, because of the younger population, that almost always equates to more renters. So we need to do a lot more on that. But affordable housing is the other one that we need to grow, because when I did my master's in Paris, I worked on housing projects. The city of Paris at that point had 4 different programs, from straight public welfare housing to a form of, you know, market housing. And so we need to have a far more diversified, richer, more inclusive versions of government tenure of housing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I might just add the political policy levers that the city has in place. Of course, this really looks at who has access to our city, the right to our city. Those who are marginalised, vulnerable, those who are whether or not we like the term key workers or essential workers, those who really are on low incomes but still have to and really should have the right to be in our city centre. And one of these schemes is our city levy, which is our contributions, which were focused very much only in Pyrmont, which was a state government's designated public social housing scheme. Federal government, apologies. And in one of our more industrial areas, which is going through renewal in Alexandria. So another one is actually selling off public land, subsidised land sale, working with community housing providers to ensure that they not only act as developer, but also as the operations of the community housing. Some of these operators are specifically for First Nations, for women and their children as well. So we are working and expanding the types of investments that's there, so that these providers can be sustainable, but they're also the experts in terms of knowing specifically the needs. We also have our Affordable and Diverse Housing Fund, which has contributed to projects in Darlinghurst, Chippendale and Surrey Hills. And finally, through voluntary planning agreements, where large developments within the city centre, developers can actually voluntarily contribute. And in total, that has meant about 2,800 affordable dwellings built, with another 2,000 in the pipeline.
Great. Well, that's a good note to finish on. We've reached the end of time, so I would like to thank Philip and William for such a rich journey through so many issues. And I think you've sort of shown a light on both successes and challenges. And also, I think we have raised the issue of how do we engage the city more? How do we do better public participation? How do we get our younger people, our emerging professionals to engage in these issues? I know also that, it's a tremendous amount of effort that goes into this. So as they often say in the US, I think we should thank you for your service. I think it's a remarkable job that you do. I think it's a remarkable intelligence that you bring to the issues of city government. So with that, on that closing note, I would urge you to put your hands together for William and Philip. And do visit us again at CSU. We will have another cities talk coming up. Do visit our website. They all go up online. So these become resources for many people to use. So with that, I would like to close out. Thank you, William. Thank you, Philip. And bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.